Let me give you just a few minutes of thoughts. See what you think. There's a story, and I think it is one of those preacher stories, but nevertheless, it's a story that's told during the time of Napoleon. Napoleon asked his drummer if he could beat a retreat, to which he said, I've never been taught how to beat a retreat, but I can beat a charge that will leave no one standing here and everyone will move forward. Well, like I say, whether that's a true story or not, I don't know, but it's a story that fits the point that I want us to make this evening. And that is that's really what life is about, moving forward. Great challenges in life. We've spending time talking about, guilt and worry and disappointment and criticism, and we've got a few more that we want to talk about, and I've got a few more that probably we won't cover this year. We'll probably just save them for maybe next year. But those are things that we all deal with. Every one of us deal with these issues on a day-to-day basis. The challenges of overcoming them, of enduring them. And the Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 12, two verses you're very familiar with, talks about seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witness, let us lay aside every weight and sin which does so easily beset us. Let us run with patience the race that's set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising shame, sat down at the right hand of God. We all know those two verses. I mean, probably all of you quoted them right along with me. And when we look at them in a lot of different ways. I've preached probably no telling how many sermons from those two verses, just in different ways, looking at them in different ways. But as I was sitting there thinking this week and thinking really about the series that we've been on Sunday mornings and Sunday nights and also in Bible classes, I began to think about the fact that, we have to endure. As Christians, there's a lot to endure. And that's true of everybody that walks the face of this earth. There's just a lot to endure. But how do we as Christians do it? Well, if you look at Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2, in many ways, there's really three groups, I guess you could say, three individuals or one individual and two groups that we could look at that really helps us to endure, helps us to keep pushing forward, helps us to keep moving forward. The first one is verse 2, where the Hebrew writer says, looking unto Jesus. When we look to Jesus, we understand he's the great example. In 1 John chapter 2, verse 6, that John reminds us that we ought to walk even as he walked. That we ought to have the mind, Paul said in Philippians 2, verse 5, that we ought to be like Jesus. But when you look at Jesus, one of the things that we often don't see and don't think about is what he endured. He endured the criticism of individuals. He endured the slander of individuals. He endured the physical, if you will, beatings and beating and then, of course, crucifixion. He endured the ridicule of people. He endured the I guess the easiest way, the best way to say it is the questioning that people had about his teaching. He endured the slights that were made about him. He endured many things. That was his life. His life was enduring, but it was enduring to set an example. An example for who? An example for us. That we can endure, we can push forward, we can make it by looking unto Jesus, by keeping our eyes on Jesus and the example that he set before us. We're able to endure. But then secondly, the Hebrew writer talks about in verse 1, he says, seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. We're encircled with so great a cloud of witnesses. Now, admittedly, there's a question on who are these witnesses. I personally think they're the folks of the 11th chapter, the great folks of faith, the folks that walk by faith, Enoch and Abraham and Moses and Noah and all these individuals that the Hebrew writer mentions that walk by faith. They become a cloud of witness to help us. They become the example. Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11 that these individuals, these things that happened to them. Now you have to understand who the them is in the context. And the them are the folks of the Old Testament. And it says that these things happened to them for examples. The Hebrew, or rather, Paul wrote in Romans chapter 15, verse 4, the things that were written aforetime. If you ever look at the Old Testament, think about it from the standpoint you say, well, we have books of law, we have books of history, we have books of poetry, we have books of prophecy. Yeah. What makes up the bulk of the Old Testament? It's really history, stories. That does not, and I'm not discounting poetry, I'm not discounting the books of prophecy, which have a lot of stories really in them. But it is to say that we can look at these folks, to look at Abraham, to look at Moses, to look at Noah, and to see the examples that they set, to see that they endure. Matter of fact, it's interesting to me that in Hebrews chapter 11, where it talks about these individuals by faith, and then he gets down to the end kind of his list, he's kind of listed some, and he talks about of Gideon and Barak and Samson and others, and he says, of whom the world is not worthy. That they live such a great life. They live a great example for all of us. And their example was just that of endurance, because that was the whole book, the whole reason for the book of Hebrews. Persevere. So the Hebrew writer says we can endure because we can keep our eyes on Jesus. We can look to others of the past. But then I think the third group is to look at those of the present. To look at those that are living the life the best they can. We often sit at funerals of good individuals and talk about their good faith. Well, that's good. And it's good that we can do that. It's a shame that we don't tell them how important they are to us while they're alive. While Paul would talk about Titus in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, the one that helped him, while he would talk about Onesiphorus, often refreshed me. He would talk about Stephanus and Forticaeus, that these were spirit refreshers. Paul would write to Timothy, a young man. How young, we don't know. But he would tell Timothy, he would say, let no one despise your youth, but be an example. Be a pattern. Be a pattern for others to look at, for others to see, for others to understand. Life's not easy. There's nothing about it that's easy. But yet, when we keep our eyes on Jesus, and we look to those of the past, and we look to great examples in the present, we're able to fight the fight. We're able to keep the faith. We're able to do what God would have us to do. So this evening, as you look at your life and see where you are, if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, would you come off the other side?